Hi all, I have a very interesting game to show you today, which actually has been used as an important example of one of the many facets of outposts. So when we consider outposts, like knight outposts, they're usually protected by a pawn and the opponent cannot attack the outpost that easily from pawns, for example. So Mikhail Tal, who did Simple Chess, was one of Britain's first grandmasters, a great player. And yeah, let's see from that perspective of outposts. But there are actually other perspectives on this game which add to the reality of really what happened, which I want to go over as well. E4 for Mikhail Tal. E5, we have lopez. Pretty standard stuff, well trodden territory so far. D6, now we have rook e1. White plays h3 to discourage the bishop g4 line. This is another line though, just d4, there's another line with bishop g4, but white prefers this. Okay, we have knight a5, pretty standard stuff. D4, knight c6. Black is trying to encourage white to play d5 to close up the position. Especially, I think, perhaps David Bronstein thought Tal's very tactical, and so he wants to keep it closed and strategic. So this line and this next move is also trying to provoke, perhaps, to close the position with queen b6. And surely Tal would not take the pawn on c5. Wouldn't he be encouraged to play d5? Well, actually, Tal knows his own style as well, and he knows that d5 is a closed position, which probably should be avoided. Even though, you know, white's gaining a space advantage, black is able to do all sorts of things later, you know, knight e8, g6, knight g7, and stuff like that. Black can get a very nice position, you know, well, to try for a draw at least. But Tal decides to keep things open. He plays d takes c5, and yes, we have a symmetrical pawn structure, which in one way increases the likelihood of a draw. But there are some interesting outpost opportunities on the one shared file. For white, it's d5, it's protected by a pawn. Also note f5 is protected by pawn, but the thing is, with an outpost, as defined by Mikhail Tal's criteria, is that it also shouldn't be able to be kicked that easily by an opposing pawn. So whilst f5, you would think it might be an outpost, it's protected, but it can be kicked with g6. So d5, because these pawns have basically forfeited their right to kick, you know, a piece from the outpost square. So the interesting thing, that the facet though about this game, I think, was being demonstrated was mainly the use of an outpost as a continual threat. My own preference for outposts is a torturous knight that continually tortures and creates threats around the opponent to deal with. But this game instance, is really about the outpost as a continual threat in its own right and how it can open up the position. So sure, that's good for white, and for black, conversely, on that shared file, d3 could be good in theory, but the side with the initiative is the side where, you know, their plans are going to take more priority. If black tries to play like c4 and put a knight into d3, sure, that's not protected by a pawn here or here. That is an outpost square for black, but it's a long way away compared to the d5 one. Knight f1, and already, right, white is gunning for d5 pretty soon. Black plays bishop e6, which seems to take care of d5 for the moment. Knight e3 anyway, but it's also looking at f5, and that is cause for concern actually for black. We have rook a d8, and it looks as though, for the moment, symmetrical pawn structure is the d5 outpost a big deal. Now, you know, simple chess takes a simple treatment of this game from the theme of outposts, and it's as if this one causes now bad dark square weaknesses. David Bronstein's next move, maybe it's not optimal. I would say it's a little bit dubious. He plays g6. It's weakening some key dark squares around the king. And who is he playing? The master of king attacks and forcing moves. So weakening key dark squares might not be the best idea. In this position, investigation has to be given to tolerating a knight coming to f5 instead of like the brute force approach of playing g6. It has clear tactical downsides to play g6. For example, h6. Let's have a look at this position. Black could be prepared the lesser evil idea of just giving up the dark square bishop. And if white's not interested in that, say white plays like this to try and, you know, have this as torture continually. So queen f3, threatening knight takes h6. It seems black with very careful play, you know, he gets out of the way of knight h6. Black with very careful play, and I believe we've seen like Magnus Carlsen play these sort of positions, that knight on f5 doesn't have to be a death knell for black's position. This kind of thing black could be holding, and he hasn't compromised the dark squares as much as this move by Bronstein. It's kind of a lazy move, really, just to play g6. It is weakening the dark squares. The thing is, how does this relate to the d5 outpost? Well, this is acting as a continual threat, this knight d5. It has to be checked all the time if it's working, because it literally explodes, liberates pieces simultaneously. It liberates the bishop, it liberates this e-file, it targets e5 all the time. So black has to be on the lookout all the time, and that's kind of exhausting in a practical game, to be on the lookout all the time for a perpetual threat of knight d5. Fischer's also played successfully from this kind of structure as well, with d takes c5, not minding the symmetrical pawn structure, by the way. We have knight g5 trying to chase that protector away. Now David Bronstein doesn't mind that at all. That would heal his d5 square if knight takes. Not only that, with this next move there'll be follow-ups of bishop c5, and all of a sudden we've got pressure on f2. We've got diagonal pressure. That would be very pleasant for black. So white doesn't really want to take on e6. He wants to keep this outpost not protected by any pawn. Doesn't want to bring that pawn into protection of d5. c4 in its own right has a downside. It's offering a pawn structure to be undermined here. This structure on the queen side, it's underminable. And even in the short term, this is going to activate at least the rook, you know, on the a file potentially. And we have another move which is not a fantastic waiting move, it has to be said. It kind of compounds creating dark square weaknesses, bringing the king out to play a little bit. When playing against Tal, if you create tactical liabilities, Tal's going to potentially find forcing moves to exploit this stuff, weaken dark squares, king a little bit more exposed now on g7. A little bit. Okay, but it's kind of a waiting move. Just hoping maybe for knight takes e6, but it's not going to happen. If knight d7 trying to use the outpost here, then this is a big threat actually, knight d5 here. But first maybe activate the rook even better first. Knight d5, bang, it liberates all of white's pieces. Example, takes. We notice the bishops are great. White's got this dangerous passed pawn potentially. This position here is just good for white now. I mean, there's things like bishop e3, rook a7. All of white's pieces are doing really well. So that's to be avoided. So black is in no position to exploit his outposts here on d3. The side with the initiative is setting the tune here. So king g7. We have a takes, which of course activates the rook. And white continues now this undermining strategy, rook b1 to play b3. However, it's not the case always that this is effective. It's effective here, b3 potentially, because the queen's on b6, because this pawn is also protected by the knight on g5. It's not always effective. For the moment, black is concerned about b3, because it's going to target b5. You know, if this opens up, then b5 is a target. The queen's looking at b5 potentially. So Tal is playing on black's structure. It's as though David Bronstein has actually created liabilities on both sides of the board. He's created one set, the dark square weaknesses, coupled with the king a bit more exposed, and he's created a pawn chain which is liable to undermining. as well on the queen side, so it's a bit fragile, and he's having to like compensate now with knight a5, decentralizing knight just to parry b3. Tal in this position decides to hit e5. The knight's not really doing that much. It doesn't really want to take on e6, so he brings back the knight now. So after knight a5, knight f3, and black here, technically the best move is just to protect e5, because b3 is no longer a threat here. The knight on g5 was actually protecting e4, so if b3, this fails here, well, at least it's no problem at all, because of knight takes e4. It's not a big deal. Black would be fine here. So knight c6 technically was the best move, but we see in the game queen c7, which is another kind of shaky move, because it's leaving the knight on the rim. The knight on the rim is dim. There are already, as I mentioned before, dark square weaknesses. The king's a little bit more exposed than it should be. Yeah, and also, of course, it is asking for a tempo gain if knight d5 is played. Is this the right moment to open the position? When you open a position up, sometimes tactical liabilities are exposed. The concrete thing about that is, you know, forcing moves will expose issues sometimes very easily. And we do actually see now the knight going into d5. Yeah, black's king is a little bit exposed. There's dark square weaknesses. So with the knight on the rim, it's not also holding e5. e5 is more vulnerable than it should be. So this is the right time to play knight d5 with, yeah, some issues for black. Black plays here, bishop takes d5, and we have e takes, and yeah, there's a big problem with e5 now. Best probably is to play knight takes d5. This might have been best to play knight takes d5, and although white has the bishop pair, it's not such a big advantage for white. But here, another kind of weakening move is played. Rook fe8. Slight weakness of this last move, the slight neglect, is another way to say that. The slight neglect is the f7 square here. On rook takes d5, I mean, there's so many ways to take on d5 here. This position, this is slightly better for white. You see after knight g4, we're poking into h6. Potentially, you know, white's slightly better there. But yeah, knight takes d5 was probably the safest. But we see rook fe8. So these points of slight neglect and dark square weaknesses, are they going to count? Well, okay, queen takes e5. Tal is not afraid here of getting the queens off. And also he's doing this, by the way, with the rooks being disconnected at the moment. We have queen takes and we have knight takes. And it's here knight takes d5 is played in this position, and it's slightly different. Now we do see a set of incredible forcing moves basically from Mikhail Tal in this position. I mean, he's blown open the center. Look at the center, it's been blown open. There's no pawns around even these 6 squares. There's no pawns, or those squares, those 8, sorry, 3, 6, 9, those 12 squares. The center's been blown wide open. White's bishops seem liberated. White's rooks are also active. So after rook a1, yeah, white's pieces are all pretty active here. And there's a question posed to this knight on a5. It actually goes to b3, which is, of course, structural damage if white takes. If it went to b7, that's the question. Not c6, we can take. That's another question. Bishop e4. This position here is also interesting. There's actually a forcing move here, which is very good. Can you spot it? If I give you 5 seconds. Okay, bishop h6 here is good because we've got a loose rook on e8. So if takes, we've got knight g4 with advantage. And if king g7, well, this is okay for white. So anyway, the knight didn't go to b7. I mean, you might think it should have, because of, you know, it looks structurally suspect to do this. The pawns are shattered, but are they going to be like potentially dangerous? But here, guess what white has here in this position? If I give you 5 seconds now. Bishop h6. It's very interesting. I mean, yeah, the waiting moves of Bronstein are kind of creating these liabilities on dark squares. The king out and about a little bit more. It's yeah, you're playing Tal here. Bishop h6. It's going to be on the move list. It's going to be on the move list at some point. Now, king g8 was played. If taking, this is interesting because these pawns do tell in the endgame scenarios. This wasn't played, but let's have a quick look. Check, takes, and yeah, it's rook versus knight and bishop. But because these pawns are so weak, rook a5, and this is really tricky. This endgame scenario for black, this is really tricky. If bishop f6, I mean, also it's worth checking out rook b8 here as well. Let's check out bishop f6. Takes. The pawns are dropping. White's better there. But say rook b8 to try and be stubborn. Rook a7. Rook e8. And here, rook d7 is winning for white. Yeah, the pieces are not really in a good shape here for black. So yeah, this position here is favourable for white. So this endgame is pretty nasty if taking, and that's the gist of it anyway. So we see actually king g8, but now knight c6, another forcing move, and it leaves a very, very uncomfortable pin now on this e file. Soon after rook ad1, yeah, Tal is getting a gigantic pin on the e file, which in this position, guess what white is threatening? If I give you 5 seconds, just to, what would white be threatening if he had another move here? Can you see? White would be threatening rook takes e7, just to give a token move. Yeah, rook takes e7 is mating. Yeah, so black uncomfortably has to play f6. His queenside pawns are dropping off though. Rook takes b5. So Tal's basically got a better ending out of all of this. Doesn't mind having better endings to play with. b3 now weak. Yes, black paid a big price earlier with his pawn chain. Now g5 trying to trap the bishop, but not that easy actually. White snaps off b3, f7 as though king g6 to munch the bishop. But some obstacles are thrown here. Rook b7, stopping the king, going without dropping that. But now we have rook e6. This drags the king away a little bit more from h6, which gives white time now to play h4, trying to bring this bishop out and back into the game. White by this stage now has got two connected passed pawns here. Rook g8 trying to keep the bishop in prison. But now f4, just breaking the bishop out by force. It also means f5 will try and lure the king away from this bishop. We see check, king f1. Yeah, the bishop is not easy to trap. G takes. And now we have rook b5, rook c8. On bishop d6, check is, I believe, good for white. So yeah, we see rook c8, check anyway, so that if king takes, there's b4, and that's just a winning endgame. This position is just, the passed pawn is too quick for black, so black cannot afford that. So we have king d6, b4. And here, yeah, black's in a bad state, clearly. He kind of capitulates with this move. If he plays bishop a7, rook here, and then bishop g7, yeah, black's just crumbling, basically. It's crumbling. So, yeah, it's gone now. We see h3. It's not a problem, this h3, because after takes, h2, there's a check. Yeah, it's hopeless. Now, is this a model game for Outposts? As Simple Chess would claim. Actually, there's other things going on. There's other issues here. There's issues that, in fact, literally created by David Bronstein on both sides of the board. He had dark square weaknesses. His king was slightly exposed. On this side of the board, he presented an underminable pawn chain. He should have brought his knight back to keep his pawn chain intact. But no, it was a total wreck with these double pawns later. So the transitioning into the endgame was favourable for white. But we do see the idea that the outpost can be used as a continual threat for black to be worried about. And that's actually a practical thing. That's draining the opponent's time and resources on the clock all the time, thinking about knight d5. But Bronstein really set himself up badly, it has to be said, on both sides of the board. The knight on the rim and the dark square weaknesses. He made knight d5 really be a serious threat. After that knight d5, the opening of that position, it was very, very dangerous for black. And Tal found, the great resource bishop h6 to really get that very nice endgame advantage. So yeah, a very, very interesting game. One which shows certain aspects of Outposts as threats to be concerned about. Okay, I hope you got something from that. Comments, questions, likes, appreciated. And also do check out Mikhail Tal's Simple Chess. Yeah, I mean, he has loads of examples of different types of outposts, and you can get it just for a few dollars from Kindle download. Actually, I've got it on my iPhone. It's one of those books. It's less verbose than Nimzowitsch My System, but covers like the fundamental elements of chess. So Knight Outposts, one of the key elements of chess, and this is one of the instructive games from that perspective of Outposts as a continual threat and concern. Okay, thanks very much.